Go ahead, Anne.
Okay. Welcome to the Everywhere Book Fest and the Putting the Story in History, a historical fiction panel. Thanks for coming. We're thrilled you've joined us and are delighted to be here. My name is Anne Bustard, and lucky me, I am here today with award-winning authors Gail Carson Levine and Linda Sue Park. I will serve as moderator, and Jenny Kamen is our wonderful ASL interpreter. If you are following live, feel free to type in where you are visiting from. We welcome your questions, and toward the end of the session, we'll save time to answer as many as we can. Before we jump into our discussion, we'd like to spend some time introducing ourselves and our books to you. Linda Sue, would you begin?
Thank you, Anne. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm the author of several different books. You might know this one, A Single Shard, which won the Newbery Medal in 2002. I wrote 2 books in the 39 Clues series. A lot of readers know me from this book, A Long Walk to Water, which is used in schools all over the United States and the world. And today I will be talking about this book, Prairie Lotus, my newest release, which is from American history. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Anne.
Gail, what about you?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jenny. So I'm Gail Carson Levine, and I am best known for Ella Enchanted, and which won a Newbery Honor in 1998. And I've written a whole bunch of fantasies since then, one historical novel, Dave at Night, and this new one, which will be out in 11 days, is called A Ceiling Made of Eggshells, and it goes way back in history. It goes back to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, when you may remember something else was happening in Spain. So I am delighted to talk to you from Brewster, New York, about writing historical fiction with these other wonderful writers.
We're so happy to be with all of you today. Just a little bit about myself. My mother named me Anne after the fictional character Anne of Green Gables, who lived in Prince Edward Island. I've lived in Hawaii, California, and many decades in Texas until I married my college sweetheart and moved to Canada, though not Prince Edward Island. I live in a town called Hamilton in the province of Ontario. I've written several books for young readers, and my newest one is Blue Skies. It is a story about a girl named Glory B, who wants a miracle. She wants her father to return home from World War II. He was lost on a beach called Omaha in France, and she is waiting for him to return. So when she discovers the Merci train boxcar is going to make a visit to her town, this is a boxcar sent from France, she just knows that this means Daddy is coming home too. It's set in 1948 and 1949, and it's a story about hope and truth and love. Okay, so let's dive into a question. How about if we recount a real or specific historical event or fact or piece of information and tell how we incorporated it into our stories. And Gail, how about if you go first?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Before the Jews were expelled, Spain was engaged in mopping up a centuries-long process of conquering of Christian Spain conquering the remains of Muslim Spain. And my main character, Loma, is very attached to her grandfather, who is a very influential financier, Jewish, in Spain. And in the process of the conquest, and he is very fond of her, and he takes her with him on all his travels. And before all of Spain fell, when Granada fell to the Christians, Malaga fell. And so my main character, Loma, goes with her grandfather to Malaga, where she sees the Muslim prisoners behind a stockade fence, and she sees the Jewish prisoners, because Jews lived in Muslim Spain and they lived in Christian Spain. She sees that the Muslim prisoners are starving and skinny, and so are the Jewish prisoners. And she hadn't been sure whether it would be wise to remain a Jew or to become a Christian, and which was always available. And then she finds out that the Muslims are about to be sold into slavery, all of them, and that the Jews, who are the prisoners, are going to be imprisoned until the other Jews of Spain, raise an enormous sum of money to ransom them. And it is that cruelty that decides her to remain a Jew, come what may. So that's how I incorporated this important event that was part of the lead up to the expulsion into the plot, and was fascinated learning about it.
What a story. Thank you. Linda Sue, tell us about yours.
Prairie Lotus is, I got to go on this, there we go, because I got the logo there. Prairie Lotus is set in 1880 in what the US government then called Dakota Territory, which was actually land owned by the Oceti-Sakowin Nation of Indigenous Americans. In Hannah's time in 1880, the main character is named Hannah. She would have called them Sioux, and it's a term that many of us are familiar with, Sioux Indians. And oftentimes the pioneer or settler story falls into the category of what's called a single story. We get the same story all through school, through popular culture, books, and movies about these very brave pioneers who set out and settled this supposedly wild land. And we don't get other points of view except that one. And so the mythology in all of our heads is really strong and very difficult to deconstruct or dislodge. But of course, the story was not the same for everyone. So Hannah is a 14-year-old girl who is half Asian, and her experience of the American West, or Midwest and West, is quite different from that depicted in a lot of popular culture. A small part of the story, but a very important one, is about how those so-called settlers were actually invading someone else's land, someone else's home. And again, in that case, it was the Oceti-Sakowin. I'm sitting in my bedroom in Rochester, New York, which is the homeland of the Iroquois Nation. All of us, if you're here in the United States, are actually, squatting basically on land that was owned by other people, not owned, but lived on by other people. They didn't think of ownership the way that we do. They were much more stewards of the land that they lived in. So all of those things go into making a more complete truth. Because if you have only a single story, if you have a single story from only one point of view, you have an untrue story. You have a false story. You actually have a lie. And it's what all of us grow up with, the incomplete story that the settling of the American West and Midwest was not the way we have been taught it in schools, or at least that part of it is only a very small part of it, a very blinkered, one-dimensional part of it. Some of it may be true, but if you only have part of the truth, you don't have the true story.
Well, we thank you for writing that story. As I mentioned in my brief introduction, something about the Merci train, it was real. It was a grassroots effort by a French war veteran named André Picard, who envisioned sending a boxcar filled with gifts from the French people as thanks for all the United States did for them during and after the war. His idea took hold like he could never have imagined. And in 1949, instead of one boxcar coming over the Atlantic, 49 came, filled with gifts from the heart. And the boxcars went one to each state, and then one was divided between the territory of Hawaii and the District of Columbia. France was devastated by the war and had very little to give, but give they did. Children's toys, books, family heirlooms, paintings, and seamstresses in the community of Lyon sewed 49 wedding dresses, one for each boxcar. Once the boxcars came to the United States, they traveled on through the rail system and to each state's capital. And the Texas boxcar was dropped off in Fort Worth, and then it went south to Austin. In Blue Skies, it makes a stop in Gladiola, which is not a real town. And the story is really a countdown to the coming of the boxcar and Daddy, and what all that Glory Bee does to prepare for what she hopes will be her father's return. Okay, I believe we have some questions, so maybe we could put one up. Thank you. Okay, Teresa is asking, how much research do you complete before writing a historical fiction? Who'd like to pop in on that?
I find it really difficult to sort of put a quantity on it, but I used to say that I like to have something like 80% of the research done before I start writing, because I want the story to come from inside of me. And if I'm constantly reaching for books or trying to go on the internet to find out some factoid, then it's not part of me. It's not inside me. So that's what I try to do. But then, of course, as I'm writing, I have to look stuff up along the way. And unfortunately, it happens more often the older I get that I don't remember everything that I've read or researched. But I have friends who do it all different kinds of ways. Maybe you gals do as well. But I like to do a lot of the reading and ruminating, and then I start to get excited and get even more excited, and pretty soon I just have to start writing. But I do a lot of the research before.
Okay. I did both. I read early on, and then didn't understand. This is over 500 years ago, and I didn't understand what I was reading for a while. And I had to read a lot before I had enough context to make sense of what I was reading. So I read books and books and books and books, but also I started writing at the same time. I worked out a timeline of what happened, and I reached out to historians, living historians, who were exceedingly kind and who spoke to me and helped me. And I Googled a ton. So it was books, it was Google, it was human beings. I got a copy of one of the earliest costume books in world history to look at. One of the resources that I used was a cookbook And the cookbook is based on ingredients that were recorded by the Spanish Inquisition, because the Spanish Inquisition would catch people who had converted to Christianity but were still practicing Judaism by the dietary rules that they were following. And these historians put together these 500-year-old recipes. And I made one of them. And one of them is in the afterword of my book. So if you read the book, you too can make Sephardic eggs.
I love it. Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit and go to one of our questions. Maybe we'll do alternating. So I'd like to ask the panelist, why did you want to write this story? Like, was there one particular something or a collective that generated your desire?
Yeah, for me, it was big. My father was a Sephardic Jew. I'm half Sephardic. And Sephardic Jews are Jews who are descended from the Jews who were thrown out of Spain. And my father, who came to this country as a very young boy, spoke Spanish as his first language. So they had been out of Spain for 400 years, and they still spoke Spanish. And then he was an orphan, and he grew up in an orphanage, and it was not a Sephardic orphanage, and he was separated from his roots, but he knew about them. And I became fascinated by them, and I had to find out. So in my imagination, my main character, Loma, is my ancestor. And she is the one with the grit to survive, because the worst happened to people after they were thrown out. And so I imagine this character who made it. And that's where the story comes from. And now I have an understanding that I am so grateful to have of where half of me comes from.
And why don't you answer that?
Okay. Well, as soon as I discovered the existence of the Merci train, I fell in love with it, and I wanted to write about the story. I was touched by the enormous outpouring of gratitude from one country to another. And I love that the French gave, such heartfelt gifts. On a personal note, I feel like I have a kinship with World War II. Before my parents met and married, they both served in the war. My father was in school at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, which sent the US into World War II. And he joined the Army Air Force the next day from England over to France. My mother finished college and then afterwards joined the Waves, which was the women's army. So growing up in Hawaii, I went to Pearl Harbor many, many times and would hear the stories of that day, though not of my father's actual service in the war, which was true of many who returned. So having found a story about World War II, and the whole idea of something positive coming from it with the gifts, I felt called to write Blue Skies.
Well, I love hearing about your personal and family connections, both of you. For me, it was even more personal. It was me, myself. 50 years ago, I would do what I realize now was the equivalent of fan fiction in my head. All the pioneer stories that I read and loved had parts of them that made me really unhappy. And I was a rereader as well as a reader. I would reread the books that I loved. And I knew in certain books when a part that I didn't like was coming. And I would hold the pages together as I turned it so I could skip that part. You know, I would hold the pages together so I wouldn't have to read the parts that made me unhappy. I would not have been able to articulate back then very well what made me unhappy. But I now know that it was things like racism and bias and erasure, you know, in those books. And in my head, I would imagine myself into those stories. And it was impossible. There was never an Asian girl in those stories, right? I had to write my way into them. And so then as I grow older, I'm like, well, were we even there? Well, actually, yeah. And there's just no mention. History books, social studies lessons, nothing. You know, you might hear about the Chinese men who helped build the railroad. That might be the only place where you would see mention of Asian Americans during that era, right? And there were things about some of these books that I just loved. They elevated daily life. Okay, that the details of daily life are worthy of literature. They elevated women's work. Okay, that women's work was worthy of literature. And I wanted to keep those good things, right? But confront the not so good things. So there was a very, very personal experience in writing Prairie Lotus. And although I would have said that every single one of my books has something in it that it makes it a heart book, there is no book that is closer to my experience as a young reader than this one.
Oh, thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you. Okay, let's take another question. Okay, Dawn. We are on a virtual field trip here with our 5th graders.
Awesome.
And we'll have much to discuss. What advice would you have for them as readers and writers?
Wow.
Ooh. Linda Sue, why don't you start with that one?
Okay. All right. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about brain science. Okay. So it turns out that reading and writing are incredibly complicated and difficult things to do, right? That's why a lot of people have trouble with them, right? And the brain activity that goes into reading and writing, okay, resides in very deep inside layers of your brain. And it also resides all over your brain, not just in one place. When scientists put electrodes on people's heads and watch them read or write, right, their brains light up in different ways than anything else, and in deeper layers of the brain than anything else. They give the brain a workout that doesn't get the brain cells that don't get worked out in any other way. All right, shorthand means if you 5th graders, if you young people don't keep reading and writing, if we all go to all digital and all screen stuff all the time, the human race is going to get stupider. Honest to gosh, we are not going to be using the deep inside parts of your brain where innovation and discovery and imagination and creation take place, and all those wonderful discoveries that help us advance life, right? So that's going to be your job. You got to keep reading and writing as much as you can, and anything counts. Graphic novels count. I don't care what it is you read anything you want. Just keep reading, keep writing when you can, because that way you are going to save the world. I'm not exaggerating, okay? Read a lot, strengthen your brains, save the world. That's how it works.
I love it.
Anne, you want to go for it?
No, jump in.
Okay. So we've saved the world, and that is a great thing. If you're interested in historical fiction, if you're interested in history, who's the most interesting person in your family? Who in your family has a history? Start asking. And also ask about your family history. Where did your family start out? 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 20 years ago. And think about who was there and what part they played in setting up the world that you live in now. And see what kind of story that makes in your mind. And then go for it. Make that story. See what happens for you on the page with those people. How did you become you from your family? Or are you in the wrong family? And is it the wrong history? And you can write about that too. So that's advice one. And advice two is that the thing that a writer needs, I think, that I certainly need most of all, is patience. Stories take a long time to come and a long time to write, unless you're fast. You may be faster than I am. But, and we don't, often, I don't get it right the first time. So 2 ideas. See what's doing in your family's skeleton box and be patient about it.
Gail, I love that, because I think sometimes when people say historical fiction, there are people who love it and there are people like, oh, history snooze, right? But history is, people think of it as the past, right? Okay, what I just said, that's the past, okay? What I just said just now, that's the past, okay? The past is happening at every single second. And all of you young people are part of history. You're part of history right now. What kind of mark are you going to leave? What is history going to remember about you?
That's amazing. All right. Maybe one more question? Then I think our time is ticking away. I can't believe how fast it's going. Let's try one more. Okay, Crystal's asking, do you ever find it difficult deciding where to blur the line between fiction and real history?
Anne, why don't you go ahead with that one?
Okay, I'm going to jump into that one. Well, I was so captivated with the Merci train story, and I had a character. I knew I had a character who desired to somehow connect with her dad through it. That I knew I had to create a fictional town. And it was an easy decision on one hand, because that gave me some more freedom, but a difficult decision on the other, because I wanted to be as historically, accurate as I possibly could. So all of the historical details in Blue Skies are true, except what happens in Gladiola, Texas. Yeah, it was a deliberate choice. And yes, I could have written a story about a real person who experienced the Merci train coming to their town, but I chose to fictionalize it. Gail, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. For one thing, 500 years ago, not everything is known. The sources are court documents, or records of the Spanish Inquisition, or rabbis' advice. So daily life was the hardest thing for me to write. And it's there that I did have to improvise some. I tried to improvise as little as possible, to the point that an early reader had to say to me, Gail, be a novelist. So I did try. I brought Christopher Columbus into the story and imagined a meeting with him and my main character and 2 other characters. And that meeting, I'm sure, never happened. But I do know for sure that all those people were actually there. So I felt like I could cheat a little bit. Since they were all there, I could take advantage of it. I tried to stay true to the history as much as I could.
My answer would take way too long and we're out of time, but it has to do with the fact that even what we call nonfiction has a lot of supposition in it. All right. So even with people who are really good at it, you are having to fill in holes all the time in history. So I ask myself, is it possible? could this have happened? And lots of times the answer is no, that couldn't have happened then. There's one author in my author's note in Prairie Lotus, which was that there were no Koreans in Dakota Territory. So that's why Hannah is part Chinese and part Korean from her mother's side back in Asia. All right, because I couldn't have a Korean girl in Dakota. That was not possible. So I'm not willing to cross that line. But if it's possible, then I can look at it in fiction and see how it works.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think it's time for us to say goodbye. Thank you to the organizers and the volunteers and the sponsors. Thank you all for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jenny.
Oh, yes,
Thank
you,
you,
Jenny, for your interpretation. And we wish you well. Putting the Story and History, a historical fiction panel at the Everywhere Book Fest is now complete. Thank you.